So thank you for coming out tonight. When I began working on this talk, it quickly became apparent to me that the topic was way more than I could address in one evening's talk. So I think what will happen is I'll probably kind of give you a broad overview of this topic tonight, and then I'm going to take pieces of it down the road in future talks to drill down a little deeper into the topic, because it overwhelmed me a bit when I started to write it. Just some context in terms of where I began to think about this was thinking about relationships in general is really central to who we are as human beings. I mean, it's just really where we spend much of our time. And relationships have to do with survival, community, connection, intimacy, procreation, cooperation, safety. The list goes on and on. It just informs every part of our experience as human beings. And, you know, we evolved this way because out of relationships and out of communities, there was safety, there was an opportunity for the species to continue, and those that didn't have relationships or didn't do well in relationships fell away. Their genes got kicked out of the gene pool, and so we continued over the course of evolution to become more and more relational beings. I'm going to talk about a range of relationships tonight, but my primary focus will be on more intimate relationships. But in general, I'm going to be speaking to all our relationships: parents, siblings, our mates, our coworkers, our bosses, our children, our friends, anyone with whom we come into contact with and have some emotional, verbal exchange. All of those constitute the kinds of relationships we have. And we all have them. We have numerous relationships, and all of them have varying degrees of intimacy, from very superficial and casual to maybe a teller at the bank, to our closest friend, our mate, whomever we're the most close to. But relationships are also where we really run into some challenges, where we get tripped up, we get conflicted, we get challenged, we get humbled, we get hurt, we get humiliated. So it's tricky ground for all of us, I think, suffice it to say. Just as a general adage, what I would say is that as our relationships get more intimate, any particular relationship, the more the challenges have a way of rearing their head, because intimacy really is one of the more difficult things, I think, that we do in terms of our relationships. I thought about this before I wrote it, but I think it's fair to say in my 42 years as a clinical psychologist that most, if maybe even all, human suffering has its roots directly or indirectly in our relationships. That's how pervasive relationships are in our existence. Now, lest I sound too gloomy, let me also say that relationships are also where we experience exhilaration, confirmation, validation, joy, closeness, safety, comfort, all the good stuff too. But that's not what I'm going to focus on tonight, because we welcome that. We don't have to manage that so much. There are thousands and thousands of studies. Modern psychology has looked at relationships from every aspect, and they have much to say about relationships. That's not going to be my primary focus tonight, although I just want to mention two things generally. One is one of the more exciting developments over probably in the last 40 or 50 years has been attachment theory. I won't get into it tonight, but it's John Bowlby's work, originated in London during World War II. And it really has to do with how our earliest relationships, our earliest bonding, our earliest connections really inform who we become as individuals. So that's been a huge new frontier in terms of talking about relationships therapeutically. John Gottman, who some of you may know, he's a well-known researcher in relationships, and he's developed what he calls the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse when it comes to relationships. And there he's talking primarily about intimate relationships, but those are quickly criticism, defensiveness, contempt, and what he calls stonewalling, which is withdrawal and silence. And he says when those four elements are present in a relationship, the likelihood that that relationship will survive is extremely low. So, what does the Dharma say about relationships? Well, not too much directly, but I think there's a wonderful richness that we can pull out or infer from much of what the Buddha taught that I'll talk about some tonight. This is from Bhikkhu Bodhi, who's a Buddhist monk and scholar, and he says, the teachings of the Buddha, while framed around the goal of individual deliverance from suffering, are also expounded for the purpose of instructing us in how we can live in harmony with others. Such harmony is desirable not only as a source of satisfaction in itself, but also because it is a prerequisite for treading the path to the higher freedom. The final piece of enlightenment can arise only in a mind that is at peace with others. And the mind can only be at peace with others when we are actively committed to a course of training that enables us to extricate the roots of conflict that lie deeply buried within our hearts. Once in ancient India, Saka, the ruler of the gods, came to the Buddha and asked, "By what bounds are people bound whereby, though they wish to live in peace without hate and hostility, they yet live in conflict with hate and hostility?" The Buddha replied, "It is the bounds of envy and avarice that so bind people that though they wish to live in peace, they live in conflict with hate and hostility." Bhikkhu Bodhi goes on to say, if we trace external conflicts back to their source, we will find that they originate not in wealth, position, or possessions, but in the mind itself. They spring up because we envy others for the qualities they possess which we desire for ourselves, and because we are driven by an unquenchable avarice to extend the boundaries of what we can label mine, M-I-N-E. And you'll recall that the Buddha talked about the three poisons, greed, hatred, and delusion, and all of those find their way into our relationships on a fairly regular basis. So I want to propose four different horsemen, with apologies to John Gottman, that I think bear more on how the Dharma informs our experience of relationships. And this is hardly a complete or exhaustive list. I'm going to talk about four tonight, and to me they're sort of the top four as I thought about them in terms of their importance in relationships. And again, keeping in mind that the more intimate the relationship, the greater the challenge that each of these four will represent for us. Now, I'm going to talk about them as though they were discrete or separate, but they're not. They're really interwoven and they overlap. But just for purposes of clarity, I'm going to talk about them one at a time. The first of these is ego. And not ego in the Freudian or psychoanalytic sense, but in the Dharmic sense. And by that I mean the belief in a separate I or a separate me. This notion that we would resist the idea of impermanence, that we believe that there's a permanent solid self, a permanent solid me. That's what I mean by ego in terms of this challenge. And as you recall, that refusal to accept that there's not a permanent self, the Buddha talked about as one of the primary sources of suffering. You know, the belief that there is a separate, permanent, solid self. So what are some of the outcomes or the qualities of this ego that we carry around? What is born of this experience? Well, things like competition, winning, self-importance, narcissism, moral superiority, privilege, selfishness, entitlement. These are all qualities that are born of this notion that I'm a separate self and I have to protect this self, I have to take care of this self, and all of these qualities can arise because of that. Now, needless to say, any and all of these can and are toxic to relationships. They really interfere with the quality of our relationships. They are antithetical to the unselfishness and the compassion and the empathy that we're called upon in our relationships if they're going to be positive experiences. You may recall that the Buddha talked about the 8 worldly winds, and I think these 8 worldly winds, which I'll list in a moment, are really ground zero for this experience of ego. As you recall, these are all on a continuum. Actually, they're polar opposites. He talked about praise and blame as 2 of the worldly winds, gain and loss, fame and disgrace, and pleasure and pain. And you can see how, if you think about those 8, that in some ways we're all battered by those winds on a daily basis. And they all have to do one way or the other with our relationships with others. And that can occur either individually or in community with others. Those winds are going to get stirred up. So I think they provide fertile ground on which we can grow and move along our path, or which we can ignore them and lie fallow and not really make any change in our life with regard to those. The second of the 4 challenges is what I'll call the absence of presence. And what I mean by that is not showing up for your relationships, not listening, not trying to understand the other person, not walking in their shoes. Tara Brach, who's one of my teachers, talks about this a great deal. If you know her talks, or if you listen to her talks or read either of her books, this is a real central theme in her teaching. And this inability to be present can take lots of forms, including being judgmental, being critical, dismissing, mocking, not understanding the other person, not giving the other person our undivided attention, devaluing the other person. There's many ways in which we don't show up for others in terms of our relationships. And we just don't remain present for the difficulties and challenges that arise in our relationships. We tend to withdraw, or we push it away. We don't want to engage around these difficult challenges that relationships present us with. Tara Brach says, quote, "We may want to love other people without holding back, to feel authentic, to breathe in the beauty around us, to dance and sing. Yet each day we listen to inner voices that keep our life small," close quotes. And it is hard to show up for others in our lives. I've spoken about that in a prior talk, about the challenges of connection. But it's a critical part. Bringing presence to our relationships is a critical part of deepening those relationships, and the absence of presence is a major obstacle to deepening our relationships. The third of the challenges is what I'll call relational grasping and clinging. You recall, grasping and clinging is the second noble truth that the Buddha taught. And here I'm talking about it in the context of other people. And what I mean by that is the wish or belief that others be who we want them to be or behave as we wish them to be. We have these fixed expectations in our lives for others, how they should be. You should behave this way toward me. It might be with our partner. Why aren't you more supportive? Why aren't you more empathic? Why don't you earn more money? Why don't you behave differently? It could be with a bank teller. Don't you know I'm in a hurry? What's wrong with you? It could be our child. Why don't you do what I tell you to do? All of these ways in which we carry around these fixed expectations for particular relationships in our lives. I've spoken about this as well in a prior talk, particularly as related to my relationship with my father, if you heard that talk. But the result of this relational grasping and clinging is that we suffer, as does the other person. It puts tremendous strain on the other person and on ourselves when we carry around these fixed expectations. Some of you have heard me tell the story about all the years I spent wishing my wife would read the New York Times every day because I did and we could discuss it. Well, she doesn't like to read the New York Times. She'd rather listen to NPR. So for years I'd sort of nag her about it or suggest it or whatever. Well, one day it occurred to me, she doesn't like to read the New York Times. And the weight was lifted off of both of our shoulders, and we've lived much happier since then. So it really matters not who we have expectations with, but we have them with most of the people in our lives. And it's something I'll talk about later in terms of how we might take a look at that. This is from Rilke. It's entitled, I Am Too Much Alone in This World. I am too much alone in this world, yet not alone enough to truly consecrate the hour. I am much too small in this world, yet not small enough to be to you just object and thing, dark and smart. I want my free will and want it accompanying the path which leads to action. And want during times that beg questions, where something is up, to be among those in the know or else be alone. I want to mirror your image to its fullest perfection, never be blind or too old to uphold your weighty, wavering reflection. I want to unfold. Nowhere I wish to stay crooked, bent, for there I would be dishonest, untrue. I want my conscience to be true before you, want to describe myself like a picture I observed for a long time, one close up. Like a new word I learned and embraced, like the everyday jug, like my mother's face, like the ship that carried me along through the deadliest storm. And then the fourth of the challenges is emotional reactivity. And this is usually born of the prior three. We usually get reactive when our ego is challenged, when our presence is absent, or when we're grasping and clinging and the other person's not meeting our expectations. Now, I'm not suggesting, even with our practice, we can ever be completely free of reactivity, but I think we can learn to reduce it and manage it more than we often do. And as you know, reactivity begets reactivity. If I am highly reactive with you, there's a great chance you're going to be highly reactive in return. Whereas if we bring presence and emotional honesty, it's more disarming. It tends to lessen the likelihood that you're going to be reactive in response to how I'm responding to you. Just a little context in terms of how this has been an issue in my own life. This has probably been the single most challenging part of my path, is managing my emotional reactivity over the years. And this was especially true in my younger adult years, though still somewhat. And in my early 20s, I had what I would call a spiritual and emotional crisis, sort of a meltdown. And it sent me looking for some relief from the suffering, and I found my way to both some really good therapy and the Dharma. Those were the two things that I began to pursue in terms of this meltdown. And both were powerful in terms of the insights that they provided. I had grown up in a family where everyone, as a matter of course, denied what they were feeling. You didn't do that. You didn't talk about it. There was a constant undercurrent of hostility between my parents, who could not have been more different or ill-suited to be together. And in fact, when my youngest brother left for college, they finally split, which was way overdue, but they were trying to do that for the sake of the kids, as though that was somehow going to be helpful to us. I sort of grew up with typical Protestant Southern values, very strict rules about outward behavior and appearance, things like manners, but really a total disregard for any kind of internal experience that any of us were having. And the unspoken ethic was that we would ignore everyone's inner life as long as everything looked good on the outside. So emotions were very repressed. There was lots of expectations of privilege and entitlement, but not any real sense that anyone knew you or sort of got who you were. So you really never knew where you stood in this family. So there were periodic eruptions without any clear trigger, just sort of out of nowhere, it seemed. And for me, it was a very lonely experience. There was really no way to feel validated. And what I did was I developed, this, unbeknownst to me at the time, because it was largely an unconscious process, this armor. I developed this armor. I put on this armor against that sort of vulnerability because I was feeling insecure. I was feeling alone. I was feeling easily threatened. I was feeling misunderstood. And the result of that armor was that my defense became reactivity. I was hypervigilant for any perceived relational danger. If I thought you were going to come at me with criticism or lack of support, my response was to be emotionally reactive. It's the old thing about the best defense is a good offense. That was the way I lived. And behind that reactivity, and I think this is probably true for many of us, it hides fear, it hides emotional pain, it hides a feeling of being not in control, a feeling misunderstood, a fear of being embarrassed or humiliated. That's what lies behind the reactivity, at least in my case, it did. So I think that it was really a primal response to perceived threat, and really not a particularly admirable trait in terms of how much of a hair trigger I had in those days. So suffice it to say, with all that, human relationships are ripe for conflict. It's unavoidable. It's part of the deal. Stephen Levine, who's a Dharma teacher, says, the reason your family pushes all your buttons is because they installed them. And these buttons really wear deep grooves in our psyche. I mean, these are patterns that really get woven, that get dug pretty deep. But that being said, we can learn to be more skillful. We can use the tools that are offered by the Buddha's teaching to navigate these 4 challenges and all the other challenges more skillfully. And it's really a good news, bad news situation. The bad news is that we each tend to act predictably in individual ways when things don't go our way. We all have our script that we follow. And that there are causes and conditions in each of our lives which result in our being triggered in whatever way by other people in terms of our relationships. Rumi says, quote, your path is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself you have built against it. And then the good news of this is that with our practice, we can learn to act less predictably, we can learn to act more skillfully, we can learn to deepen our relationships. Tara Brach says, the world is divided into people who think they are right. That one takes a minute, doesn't it? This is from Mary Oliver, as you know, my favorite poet. You do not have to be good. You do not have to walk on your knees for 100 miles through the desert repenting. You only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Tell me about despair, yours, and I will tell you mine. Meanwhile, the world goes on. Meanwhile, the sun and the clear pebbles of the rain are moving across the landscapes, over the prairies and deep trees, the mountains and the rivers. Meanwhile, the wild geese high in the clean blue air are heading home again. Whoever you are, no matter how lonely, the world offers itself to your imagination, calls to you like the wild geese, harsh and exciting, over and over announcing your place in the family of things. So what are some of the teachings that offer us better ways to manage this relationship challenges? What exactly can we take from the Dharma? And the things I'm going to talk about presume that we have a committed practice, that we are engaged with our practice. Because relationship work is very hard. I would argue that in some ways it's the hardest thing any of us ever are called upon to do, is the kind of work that deepening our relationship asks of us. And the overarching practice that is going to sort of overshadow everything that I'm going to say henceforth is bringing mindful awareness moment to moment to our interactions with others. That's the baseline, bringing mindful awareness moment to moment to our interactions with others. That's why the practice is so essential. So I'm going to just go through 6 different practices that I think can give us some ways of improving the quality of our relationships. first of all, is non-judging awareness of our own, of how we are with regard to those 4 challenges that I described. The ego issues, the lack of presence, the grasping and clinging, and the reactivity. And that we can accept this is where I am with these now without condemnation, without criticism. And if we don't do that, if we can't honestly say this is where I am with these, chances are we are not going to get out of the starting gate. So it's bringing mindful engagement to really build awareness of where we are with these challenges in each of our individual lives. And using our practice to shine a light into the dark corners of who we are, all those shadow self parts of our personality, all those things that get us in trouble, all of those well-worn grooves in our psyche, all the parts that we disavow or don't want to acknowledge. So we're talking about really brutal self-honesty, that we would drop the ego illusions about ourselves that deny that we have issues in any of these 4 categories that I described earlier. That we would acknowledge the ego's compulsion to make reality different than it really is. I mean, that's one of the things the ego tries to do. No, it's not that bad. You're okay over here. That we'd acknowledge the ego's quality of judging mind, how it tries to get us, how it causes us to be judgmental. And the ego's preoccupation with the past and the future and not be in the present moment. So that's why this non-judging moment-to-moment awareness is so critical as the foundation. The second is wise speech as an antidote to the emotional reactivity that I talked about. Joseph Goldstein, the teacher, says, make wise speech the cornerstone of your practice. So by pausing before we speak, as is central to wise speech, putting a pause between that strong emotion and before I open my mouth, is a way of breaking that chain of reactivity. If I keep that hair trigger and I don't put the pause in, I'm going to get into trouble. I'm going to screw things up. I've seen it in my own life countless times. And when I can, and when I'm feeling triggered and feeling reactive, and when I remember and I can catch it, to wait a moment until I feel less reactive and then respond. It often happens with emails. I'll get one and it's whatever, it's upsetting to me, it's triggering. And I've learned to just walk away from the computer for a few minutes and then come back. Because if I start typing right away, it's going to escalate. Guaranteed. So it's really about the value of the pause, putting the pause in there. The third is presence, which I spoke of earlier. Creating presence for the other to connect, to feel safe. Creating a safe interpersonal environment for myself and for you. Including full attention, listening attentively to your partner or the other person as a form of practice. Not formulating your response, not doing your grocery list, really listening actively. And we need to clarify our intention to establish presence in terms of our interactions. So we have to be clear on our intention. We have to set the intention that when I meet with you and interact with you, I'm going to try to bring presence to that interaction. The fourth practice is cultivating equanimity to face the 8 worldly winds that I spoke of earlier. So rather than clinging to praise and pushing away blame, we would try to develop equanimity and do neither cling to praise or push away the blame, neither cling to fame or seek to avoid loss, neither cling to gain or seek to avoid loss, cling to fame or seek to avoid disgrace, cling to pleasure and seek to avoid pain, bringing equanimity to each of those worldly winds. And here the challenge is to be present with whatever comes up and neither cling to it nor avoid and push it away. And we accept all of life as it is, the good, the bad, and the ugly, as it is. Mary Oliver says, someone I loved once gave me a box full of darkness. It took me years to understand that this too was a gift. The fifth practice is cultivating wisdom, and from this wisdom is born greater compassion and empathy by seeing the full picture of things. That's part of wisdom. Sorry. It includes the ability to put ourselves in the other person's shoes, to acknowledge their point of view, to get unhooked from the ego's self-interest, to win, to be right, to be superior, to allow the ego to distort our reality to that extent, to share our vulnerability. I think that's part of wisdom from which we all suffer, whether we openly admit it or not. Philip Moffitt says, surrender your ego in relationships. And number 6 is trying to keep our expectations low, acknowledge we cannot control others, we cannot control how they behave toward us. We need to let go of the need for them to be as we wish them to be and accept them as they are. Now, that doesn't mean we can't give feedback. That's different. I think that's constructive. I'm talking about the unspoken expectations which trigger me when you don't behave in a way that I think you're supposed to. And I would argue that, as B.Q. Bodhi alluded in the opening quote, that our practice can really bog down unless we're addressing these relational issues. It's really where the rubber meets the road in terms of how we are in our lives with regard to the practice, in making sure the practice continues to move us along the path. So if you would, I'd like to take a few minutes to do a guided reflection with regard to what we've just been talking about. So if you just get comfortable and close your eyes. Now, and bring to mind a recent conflict that you had with another person. Could have been today, yesterday, whenever, just a recent conflict. And as you think about it, allow yourself to feel the ego's needs. I'm right, they're wrong, I deserve it, how dare they? Try to zero in on the ego's needs in that conflict. Now try to see the grasping and clinging that you bring to that conflict in whatever way you think they should behave, they should treat you. Where's the grasping and clinging with that conflict? Now, can you feel your self-absorption? Can you feel the lack of presence? The break in the connection from the lack of presence? It might be in the form of formulating your response to what they said or did. And finally, can you feel your reactivity? Feel it in the body, tightness, constriction. It might be in the form of planning what you're going to say, your response. So just sit with those feelings, each of those 4 areas for a few moments. Now imagine that same interaction, but imagine yourself stepping back from the ego's needs. Give yourself permission to not be right, to not win, to not be superior. Surrender your ego, as Philip Moffitt instructs us. Now let go of any expectations as to how that other person should act, how they should behave toward you. Same interaction. Imagine being fully present, listening with your full attention. And then finally, imagine putting in a pause, a breath or two, before you respond to that person. Use wise speech. Now check back in. Do you feel any shift internally, a lightening, maybe greater spaciousness around that interaction, some relaxation, some ease? Okay. You can open your eyes when you're ready. But I think it's useful to walk ourselves through that just to see the contrast between when we bring those 4 patterns to a relationship and then we try to remove them from the interaction. And as you know we talk about this just about every week, that so much of our practice is about letting go. And that's no less true here. It's about letting go of the ego's needs, letting go of not being present, letting go of the grasping, clinging, letting go or putting aside the reactivity. I know for me this has been a huge issue in my relationships. It's really one of the greatest gifts that I've gotten from this practice. It's ongoing. I'm deeply grateful for how this has impacted my family relationships, my friendships. And I think the challenge is that we each try to be mindful moment to moment, daily, in how we manage these aspects of our relations to others. It really is an effort to give us a roadmap for how to do that. So I would encourage you to acknowledge the role that these 4 patterns have in your own life. Shine that flashlight into those dark corners. Bring the tools we discussed tonight to bear on those 4 patterns. And experience the reduction in suffering for yourself and those around you. And see what a gift this is from the Dharma. So I'll close with another Mary Oliver poem called The Journey. One day you finally knew what you had to do and began, though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble and you felt the old tug at your ankles. Mend my life, each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough in a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. So let's just sit for a couple minutes before we end.